If you want to be a better writer, there are 3 things you need to do. 1. Understand storytelling principles. 2. See how other writers have applied those principles. And then 3. Use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched the movie West Side Story. This 2021 musical was directed by Steven Spielberg from a screenplay by Tony Kushner and based on the original musical conceived by Jerome Robbins with music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, and a book by Arthur Lawrence. Now, a heads up, there are spoilers because we cannot possibly discuss the craft of storytelling without them. Melanie, why don't you start by telling us why you chose West Side Story?
So I chose West Side Story because I wanted to study this version of the story to see if a classic can still be meaningful to a modern audience. And because I love a tragic love story, this is a cautionary love story as well. And one of the main reasons as well was to see if there were any changes made to the original script. And if so, what impact did it have on the story's genre? So I spoke last week about being conscious of my expectations of a movie before and after watching it. So Late Night was a movie I'd never seen before, so it was interesting for me to compare my expectations before and after the movie. However, this week is very different. I have seen versions of West Side Story before. I heard the music long before I saw the original movie. I also saw a stage show version of it in Sydney. And now I've watched the Steven Spielberg's modern take on this story. Can I just say, no matter how powerful parts of West Side Story are, I think Romeo and Juliet, on which West Side Story is based, packs a better punch at the end. That's because Romeo and Juliet is a more powerful cautionary tale. The tragedy of Mercutio, Tybalt, Paris's, Romeo and Juliet's deaths and the final death of Lady Montague from grief is far more powerful than Riff's, Bernardo's, and Tony's deaths and Chino's imprisonment. Not because of the numbers, but because the hatred between the Montagues and the Capulets caused the death of their hope and their future, which are represented by their children Romeo and Juliet. And in West Side Story, the ending is tragic, and it shines a light on the dissolving of the American dream for the Puerto Rican community in the movie, which is represented by Anita. And there is the personal loss for the ensemble cast. And Maria faces a double loss. But for me, that ending is not as damning as the feud between the Capulets and the Montagues. The ending of West Side Story is inevitable for this tragic love and societal story. It's no surprise that these 2 genres drive the action of this movie. And it's the societal story that sets up and wraps around the tragic love story. And what do I mean by societal story? So in Story by Robert McKee, a societal story identifies problems with society. And in West Side Story, these would be immigration, assimilation, and poverty. Because this is a tragedy, the plot doesn't propose a cure. It shows the worst possible outcomes if the problems identified in the movie aren't addressed. West Side Story also presents a case for the inevitable outcomes of hypermasculinity. The only outcome for escalating physical violence is death. And as the Sharks say to Chino when he asks them what did Bernardo die for, they respond, and for pride. Bernardo, he died showing those gringos how tough Puerto Ricans are. While I watched this movie this time, I caught myself being hopeful for Tony and Maria. I don't know why this was, because as I mentioned, I've watched this movie many times and I know what the ending is going to be, but I do love tragic love stories. I think tragic love stories stay with me longer. They make me ponder, how could this have been avoided? If only the Jets did this, and if only the Sharks had done that. How would I have felt if Tony and Maria had walked away together? Well, it wouldn't have had the same impact on me at the end. Most of us also have had our own tragic love stories. We know how good love can be because we also know how painful it can be and how sometimes tragic the endings can be as well. The tragic love stories can be told over and over again and still seem relevant because they are still our lived experiences. West Side Story is a great example for us to test our expectations of a tragic love story because we know it so well. And I know Tony and Maria will meet, fall into forbidden love, kiss, plan to run away so they don't have to live within the expectations of their communities, etc. And if any of those story components were missing, then the feelings of heartbreak for the lovers and their communities at the end would not be there. So if the love story didn't include all of those moments and the scenes that I would expect in this movie, then I would be pretty annoyed and disappointed and upset.
Melanie, this is really interesting to me. So just for those listening, Melanie and I, we study the stories separately, and then we come together on our recording days to record our parts. And that's kind of when we start to see what each other came up with. And when I was identifying the genre of West Side Story, much of what I put in my notes is exactly what Melanie had put in her notes. I also went to McKee's story because, as we mentioned last week, there's very little written about genre. There really is. And I knew that West Side Story had popped up in McKee's book. So I was curious, how did he classify this? And he calls it a musical with the subgenre of social drama. Now, I agree it's a musical. I mean, that's kind of hard to deny. But like Melanie, I am scratching my head about it being a social drama. I see this, just like Melanie, as a classic love story. It's a story of forbidden love that ends negatively. It is a Romeo and Juliet ripoff, but it's set in 1957 New York rather than 1597 Verona. We have the Sharks and the Jets instead of the Capulets and the Montagues. We've got the secret marriage. We've even got the balcony scene. Now, it's not that I think that McKee is wrong. The goal here is not to prove that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. The goal here for me is to learn and to deepen my understanding of story. And for this season, I'm focusing on genre. So I'm considering West Side Story now from McKee's perspective as a social drama. And yeah, I see the social aspects of the film. Those are as undeniable as this being a musical. But I see them differently. I see the social aspects as a force of antagonism that keeps lovers apart. Because in any love story, there's hinderers and helpers, right? There are people or forces that bring the lovers together, and there are people or forces that keep them apart. And in West Side Story, I see the social issues between the Jets and the Sharks as a force of antagonism keeping Tony and Maria apart. So for me, the social drama isn't the point of the story. It's just an aspect of the story. And it provides color to the, no pun intended, color to the love story and helps shape it. As I think, Melanie, you said it frames the love story. It wraps around the love story. And yeah, that's exactly how I see it. In his book, McKee defines a social drama as a story that, quote, identifies problems in society. For example, poverty, the education system, communicable diseases, the disadvantaged, antisocial rebellion, and so on. And then it constructs a story demonstrating a cure, end quote. He also says that social dramas, if not done well, can be didactic because they, quote, identify a social ill and dramatize its remedy, unquote. Fair enough. I have no problem with that. I totally understand what McKee is saying. But West Side Story doesn't present a cure for the social problem. Maybe that's one of the reasons it's a cautionary tale. No one is really looking for a cure either, right, in the story. The Sharks and the Jets, they just kill each other. And the surviving gang members, yes, they mourn the loss of their leaders, but it's by no means certain that they'll change their ways because of what's happened. In fact, they both lean into it, right? The Jets attack Anita, and Chino, who is a shark, kills Tony. And presumably he goes to prison for it because the cops show up in the end as it fades to black.
Yeah, they're really good points. And, I think just by dramatizing those parts of the society story, or the leaning into as opposed to being critical of their actions, is a really valid point. And I think it probably helps fit within the tragic story that we're being told. So the societal story is tragic as well as the love story. So what does the love story in West Side Story show us apart from hitting all the expectations of a well-known story? Well, I think it's an excellent example of starting with the ending in mind. A tragic love story can be framed by the larger tragic societal story. The context of the love story is set up by showing the Jets as they walk around, creating trouble with the intent of inciting the sharks, and then the sharks retaliate. Everything in West Side Story is inevitable and mirrored in its characters. Valentina, for example, a Latina who married a gringo, sits on the outside of this community. She's trusted by neither, and she foreshadows one possible future for Tony and Maria. The other love stories in West Side Stories are lighter, but they're not fully explored. But in this version, Anita's character is more prominent. She is not going to be a traditional Puerto Rican wife. At the beginning of the movie, she loves the opportunities America gives her. Her rejection of Bernardo's married proposals is possibly an example to Maria of going against the Puerto Rican traditions, like being set up with the right type of boyfriend, like Chino. Riff and Bernardo are opposite sides of the same coin, fighting each other because they can't fight the larger system that keeps them at a disadvantage. Neither knows how to de-escalate, but they also don't understand the consequences of their actions until it's way too late. And for me, the biggest failing of this movie, can I say, is Ansel Elgort as Tony. He is unconvincing and did not meet any of my expectations for Tony. He's got as much charisma as wet sand in my togs after a day at the beach. You just want to take them off and wash yourself and get rid of it. It was ugh for me. It was really yucky. And I think the explanation as to why this was the case for me was succinctly stated by Janet Burroway in her book Writing Fiction, and I quote, "Readers of genre fiction have very specific expectations when it comes to plot, characters, setting, and theme, and each genre has its own conventions and rules," unquote. And in a cast that is bursting with expression and emotion, Elgort is just not. And in another section, Burroway says, "Though you aim at individuality and not typicality in character, your characters will exhibit typicality in the sense of appropriateness," unquote. And I think that's also where Elgort falls apart for me as Tony. Because what do we know about Tony? We know that he needs to fit within West Side Story's love story and the societal story. He is a former Jets member, so he's lived in the area and been part of the gang. He's been to prison for assault and is on parole, and it's changed him. Well, on the surface, it's changed him. Riff is his best friend. He trusts Valentina, but he has a feeling also that his life is going to change before he meets Maria. He's also the romantic lead, and in a fit of rage stabs the brother of his beloved. Tony's role in what Christopher Vogler describes as a tragic hero in the book The Writer's Journey. So a tragic hero is flawed and never overcomes their inner demons and is brought down and destroyed by them. So Tony was the Jets' enforcer before prison, and although he's changed at the beginning of the movie, this gives us a clue about the darker side of Tony, and it's the darker side that emerges when he stabs Bernardo. There are opportunities for Elgort to show Tony's darker, grittier side and then pull back and show that as part of his personality before it bursts out of him. But I think Elgort misses those opportunities. And it's Tony's impulsiveness that is also missing from the performance. And showing some of this would also make his sudden and complete infatuation of Maria far more believable. So the takeaway for me is that the main character must, through their micro and macro actions, fit within the genres of the stories we are telling. In my view, Steven Spielberg's interpretation of West Side Story remains true to the original versions with a few notable modern additions, including some of the dialogue, which includes Spanish for the Puerto Rican characters, the addition of Valentina instead of Doc as Tony's mentor. There is more dialogue and screen time for secondary female characters, and there's a plausible backstory for Tony, because in the original there was no explanation as to why Tony was no longer in the Jets. Even though the 2021 version is still set in the 50s, West Side Story's commentary on society is still relevant because the fires of fear inherent with immigration and otherness remain with us 70 years after the original West Side Story was released. And I think Valerie has some really good things to say about innovating the love story.
Yeah, like everything that you've just said about how they tried to innovate these society aspects, that's great. Bottom line here is that I think they missed an opportunity to also innovate the love story. So, yes, there is a framework for story, but within that framework, we are free to innovate as writers and as creators. And in fact, we must innovate. Otherwise, it's boring. And your readers and your viewers, they've seen the story already. Why should they see it again? So Spielberg had to do something different. He couldn't just carbon copy the 61 version. Okay, great. So we've said that West Side Story is a love story. And honestly, I have heard people say that love story is almost impossible to innovate. And I've got to be honest, I am one of the people who was saying that. And I want to take it back right now because I was wrong. I fell into the same trap that I think Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner fell into with this reboot of West Side Story. Years ago, when I was building my first house, an acquaintance was also building her first house. And she kept bragging about the fact that she was spending a lot less money than I was. And my mother said to me, "Yeah, you can build a cheap house cheaply." Well, you know what? The same thing applies here. You can tell a stereotypical story stereotypically. Yes, West Side Story, this 2021 version, has beautiful costumes, amazing choreography. The music is to die for. The cinematography is just so good that you can just drink it in. And yeah, Ariana DeBose absolutely deserves her Oscar. But I'm focusing here on the story because as a writer, that's the only thing I can control. I'm a novelist. I got words on a page. Even if you are a screenwriter, you're dealing with words on a page because all this other stuff, costuming, choreography, music, cinematography, casting, all outside our control. So we've already said that West Side Story is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Well, guess what? Romeo and Juliet is a tired old story, and it's constantly being resurrected in the same tired old way. And West Side Story is just another example. It's the same story, but in a different time and at a different place. Even though nearly 400 years have passed, nothing in the dynamic between the relationship of the characters has really changed. Not much. The filmmakers updated the social tensions from the 61 version, as we've been talking about, but they didn't update the love story. Instead, they chose to perpetuate outdated stereotypes, and it drives me bonkers. The 2021 version, as I said off the top, it was directed by Steven Spielberg. It has a screenplay by Tony Kushner, And it's based on the 61 version, which was done by Jerome Robbins, Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Sondheim, and Arthur Lawrence. That's 6 men. The most disturbing thing about all of this for me is that I bet that Spielberg and Kushner, and maybe Disney too, didn't even notice that they were perpetuating a stereotype. I'm betting that it's so deeply ingrained in our culture and our collective unconscious that we've accepted it as normal when it's anything but. Now, I'm going to get a lot of flack for what I'm about to say. I already know that I'm going to get hate mail. Hey, I did an analysis of Blade Runner. Which I didn't think was all that great. I got a lot of hate mail from that. So I'm expecting hate mail from this too. I'm going to get messages telling me, I know, that I'm cranky or I'm cynical or that I hate men, and all that old tired baloney. None of it's true, by the way. But what is true is that I'm 51 years old and I am so past the point of caring. All right, let me circle back to what I was saying about stories and how they're deeply ingrained in our psyche. I want to read a little bit from Wired for Story by Lisa Cron. And this is right on page 1. She writes, "Story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. A story told us what to hang on to. Story is what enabled us to imagine what might happen in the future and so prepare for it, a feat no other species can lay claim to. Opposable thumbs or not. Story is what makes us human, not just metaphorically, but literally. Recent breakthroughs in neuroscience reveal that our brain is hardwired to respond to story. The pleasure we derive from a tale well told is nature's way of seducing us into paying attention to it. In other words, we're wired to turn to story to teach us the way of the world." Let me say that again. We're wired to turn to story to teach us the way of the world. That is huge. Just let it sink in for a minute and keep it in your mind as you listen to what I'm about to say. And ask yourself, do you know what stereotype I'm talking about? Well, if you don't, I'm going to tell you. So here's the thing that's sort of the thorn in my side right now. We've got a young, naive girl falling head over heels in love with an older man that she doesn't really know. She gives up her whole life to be with him. Now, older could be 20 years older, it could be 5 years older, but he's always older. And this man is usually nothing to write home about either. Yet, the idea of not spending her life with him drives the girl to, at best, sink into a deep depression, or at worst, commit suicide or try to. And the audience is rooting for her to do it. Why? Because we've been trained to. We have seen this trope so often that it's become normalized. It looks acceptable. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this, but I'm just going to list a couple here. Twilight was a huge hit, but when Edward breaks up with Bella, she tries to kill herself. Are we really saying that an acceptable response to your boyfriend breaking up with you is for you to kill yourself? And by the way, he's a vampire. He's a vampire. He's a monster. Beauty and the Beast, another Disney classic. Belle falls in love with what? A beast. He is a beast. Now listen, honey, if he's a beast on the outside, he's a beast on the inside. There is no prince in there. Your love is not strong enough to change him. These are the lessons you learn by the time you've reached 51. In West Side Story, the presentation we have here of Tony is that he's a beast. Sure, they hired Ansel Elgort to play the role because he's handsome and he's innocent looking. He's got a baby face, which is why he also got the role in Baby Driver. But Tony is the kind of fish you throw back. He's not the fish you hang on to or marry. Toss that sucker back. If this were in real life, okay, here's what his dating profile would look like. You tell me if this is the kind of guy you want your daughter dating or marrying or bringing home. Get this. And I'm putting it in first person because I'm just pretending this is what Tony would put in his online dating profile, okay? I nearly killed a kid with my bare hands. I just got out of prison and I'm still on parole. I know I can't go to the neighborhood dance because it will violate my parole, but I go anyway because I still think the delinquents I used to hang around with are, quote, the greatest, and I can't say no to them. I say I want to change, but I don't act like it. I scare myself. I have zero self-awareness, unlike my buddy Riff, who knows exactly who he is, although he says he doesn't. The only person who will help me is a 90-year-old woman. I sleep in the basement of her store, and I stock shelves to earn my keep. I have zero prospects for the future. I expect a woman whom I've known for 24 hours to run away with me, which, by the way, means I'll be breaking my parole, and also this woman who I expect to become my wife within 24 hours will be spending the rest of her life on the wrong side of the law. Oh, and by the way, I killed my wife's brother, then I expect her to have sex with me while his blood is literally still on my clothes. These are the facts about Tony. Right? Now, here are some facts about Maria. Again, I'm putting this in the first person because, I got to jazz this up for myself. Again, I'm pretending this is their dating profile because I work from home by myself and this is the way I entertain myself. All right, so here's Maria. Here's what we know about her. I'm a young woman, 18, with a job. I have my whole life ahead of me. I spent my childhood looking after my father. I've been looking after him since I was 6 because my older brother abandoned us. I make my own way in this life. I pay 1/3 of the rent in the apartment I share with my brother and his girlfriend. I think my brother's a dictator, and although I say I'm not afraid of him, I do what he says. My brother makes me dress like a little girl. His girlfriend makes me wear my hair like a little girl. And as an aside, by the way, if you look up a picture of Alice in Wonderland, who really is a little girl, she has the same dress and hairdo as Maria does in this film. My brother doesn't let me wear makeup. My brother and his girlfriend decide who I should date. All right, so here are some facts about us as an audience watching the interplay between these two characters. And some facts about how the stories we have consumed up to this point in our lives have trained us to think about love stories and what is and isn't acceptable behavior. Now, keep in mind that West Side Story is based on Romeo and Juliet, which is widely considered to be one of the greatest love stories of all time, and a love story that we've been fed over and over and over and over. Okay. It's only about 36 hours between the time that Tony and Maria meet at the dance and when Tony is killed. We either don't notice that or we don't think it's odd. When Tony shows up at Maria's window after having just met, we expect Maria to be both flattered and enamored. She tells him to go away, but he ignores her. Now, in real life, we tell kids that no means no. Except in stories like this, we're learning that we are fed over and over and over and over again. We're learning that no means yes. What is it Lisa Cron said? Quote, "We're wired to turn to story to teach us the way of the world." More than that, hours after having met, Tony tells, not asks, Maria to run away with him. We've been trained to think that this is so romantic. We expect Maria to jump at the chance. Why? It's Tony. He is so cute. He's got the voice of an angel. Like, spare me. Why do we think this is romantic? Why do we think that a young woman with her whole life ahead of her is supposed to throw her future away to be with a convict? Remember, at this point in the story, Tony has said that he scares himself, and we've not yet seen any evidence that he has changed or has been rehabilitated. At the museum, Tony confesses that he came within a hair's breadth of beating a kid to death and that he's just gotten out of prison. This is the midpoint shift of the story. We have been trained to have tremendous empathy for Tony. We've been trained to expect Maria to be okay with this, and she is. Not only is she okay with it, but she marries dude on the spot. Like, what? What is this about? This is a guy who scares himself. He refuses to hang out with the Jets because he doesn't trust himself. He still thinks they're the greatest, but he knows he can't be trusted to rumble with the guys, right? Yet we've been trained to think it's appropriate for Maria to marry him. And then in real life, we wonder why so many women not only marry their abusers, but stay with them. We've been trained to believe that a man who is a beast on the outside is really a prince on the inside. It might sound like a really big stretch here from going from a story like West Side Story or Beauty and the Beast to what's happening in the real world. It's not a stretch. It's a direct line. When Tony kills Bernardo, he runs to Maria and climbs in her window. She says, "No, do not enter. If you enter, I'll kill you." He ignores her again, and he comes in anyway. Now, this is a point in the story where we see Tony trying to do the right thing. And in a rewrite, in a reimagining of this 61 film, I would have loved to have seen Tony with more depth, with more promise. I would have loved to have seen Maria with more backbone. I think there was lots of room in this film to get out of these stereotypes and to do a lot more with both of these characters. And in this moment, yeah, we do see Tony trying to do the right thing. He says he's going to turn himself in. This is good. This is really good. It's finally some self-awareness for Tony. I mean, it's too little too late, but it's something. And what's Maria's response? She says, "If you let the police take you away from me, how do I forgive you for that?" And we think it's romantic. He nearly killed a kid the first time, and now he has killed someone, so his violence is escalating. Yet, if you go back and look at this shot in the film, the camera is over Tony's left shoulder. We're looking over Tony's left shoulder. It's about an hour, 54 minutes into the film. He is standing over her as a dark shadow, and she is on the floor like a little girl with her skirt all spread around her. She's clinging to him and begging him to stay. There's this soft, dramatic, romantic music playing. The light is low. And all of this that's going on in film, the lighting, the music, how the actors look, the acting itself, it all is manipulating us, right? I mean, this is what great filmmakers, this is why they do it so well. They're pulling on their toolbox to evoke an emotional response in us. Absolutely. Of course they are. That's their job. And in this moment, they are using those resources to make us think this is romantic. But if you stop for a second and realize that Tony is standing there with Bernardo's blood on him, literally, and Maria embraces him and forgives him and then has sex with him, well, like what? So their pretend marriage, or unofficial marriage, I should say, is now consummated, right? Can somebody please explain this to me, because I don't get it? Why, oh why, oh why are major Hollywood studios and producers in 2021 still telling audiences that this is okay, that a man can still be as violent as he wants and the woman will still forgive him and reward him with sex, if you think of sex as a reward? Now, you might think that I'm being melodramatic. I've gotten that criticism before. I will get it again. I'm okay with it. You might also be saying, come on, Valerie, it's just a movie. Lighten up. But as writers, it's essential that we understand the power of story. We all look to story to understand how to behave and to learn what's expected of us. That's as true for fables like The Boy Who Cried Wolf as it is for Hollywood feature films like West Side Story. Storytelling is really serious business, guys. And as writers, we have a huge responsibility. Now, historically, white men have been almost entirely responsible for the stories we've read and we've watched. And yes, in West Side Story, they have made an attempt to address the social issues and the race issues. That is a wonderful step forward. But they've neglected to also update the portrayal of Maria. She is still submissive. They've neglected to update the concept of what a truly loving relationship is. And they could have done that while still keeping a tragic love story. In fact, you know what? It would have, the tragedy of the ending and society as a force of antagonism keeping these lovers apart would have been all the more powerful if we saw young lovers who were equal, or if we saw Tony as a changed person or something like that. There's lots of stuff they could have done. The stereotypes clearly worked in 1597, or we wouldn't still be reading about and hearing about Romeo and Juliet. They might have also worked in 1961. But in 2021, 2022, I mean, come on, it doesn't cut it. It's nowhere near the mark. As storytellers, we can do better than that. All right, so let's talk about innovation. What could they have done? Well, anytime we want to innovate a genre, the first thing we have to do is study all the existing stories in that genre. Then what we have to do is take a really big, giant step backwards and ask ourselves, what needs to change? And the trap that I fell into when I said that love stories are hard to innovate is that I didn't take a big enough step backwards. I was also seeing the relationship between Maria and Tony as romantic. I saw it as normal. So, while we work within the framework of a love story, because the audience still has to recognize a love story as a love story, we all have a responsibility to start being creative and start changing up elements. I'm using a love story here as an example, but whatever genre it is you're writing in. Look around you and ask yourself whether the things that worked in the 60s or in the old versions of the stories in the genre that you're working in, do they still work today? If not, why not? And what about that can you change? For West Side Story, I think they could have changed the ages of the characters, or, any love story. They can change the ages of the characters. You can have an older woman with a younger man, and please, for God's sake, do not present her as a cougar. That is also already old and tired. You could have the woman tell the man to go and get his act together first and then come back, because Maria has her act together when we meet her. Tony does not. You could give the woman a goal that is something other than getting married. Imagination that. That's what my sister used to say when she was a little girl. Imagination that. You could also write the woman as a woman and not as a little girl in a woman's body. Now, that's different. We are starting to see stories moving in these directions, absolutely, and I love it. But when major players in the industry, like Disney and Steven Spielberg, use their power and influence to perpetuate these tired old stereotypes, it drives me nuts. And that's all I have to say about that today. Melanie?
You've made it hard for me now. But on want to say that I think one of the reasons that I enjoyed the Captain Marvel movie so much was because there was no love story arc in it for the protagonist. And I found that incredibly refreshing and far more aspirational as a story as a result of that. So I fully understand and get where you're coming from. And I think it's important that we rewrite or we forecast and project the future that we want and not regurgitate older stereotypes. So I think absolutely what you were saying with Lisa Cron was true. Let's start imagining a better future, and let's start imagining greater roles for our female characters. But I think before I go on to talk about the takeaways from today's from our conversation and our action steps, I think it's important for us as writers to understand the audience is experiencing an internal journey while watching and reading our stories. So even when we're writing a period piece, consider the sensibilities of your audience and the vicarious experiences you are providing for them. Wide for Story does cover this in depth, and I highly recommend this as a craft book. And perhaps this is why Maria's roles and actions in West Side Stories and other parts of the story no longer ring true. So we want to end each episode with an action item for you. And during this episode, we've talked about the 3 steps to improving your craft. The first, understanding storytelling principles. The second, seeing how other writers have applied those principles and then using them in your own work. This podcast is about the first 2 steps, but we want to leave you with an action item so that you can get started on the third. Okay, so here is this week's action item. Think about the ending you have in mind. Does it fit the story you are writing? Will the characters' actions in the story give the reader clues as to where the ending is going to go? And this doesn't mean make it predictable, but it does mean the ending has to make sense. So what do you want the reader to feel at the end of your story? And if the ending makes sense in the context of the story, then you will be one step closer to leaving readers with a sense of satisfaction.
And that wraps that up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/Inner Circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram @Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out more about Melanie, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit her on Facebook. She's listed under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.